The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Margaret Foster's modest two-story home in Springfield, Illinois, as she carefully arranged legal documents across her kitchen table. At 72, her silver hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for decades of teaching third grade, and her weathered hands moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime organizing classroom, materials, and grading papers. The house itself told the story of a life dedicated to education, walls lined with photographs of graduating classes, bookshelves packed with children's literature and educational theory texts, and a desk drawer filled with thank you cards from former students who'd gone on to build their own families and careers. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mrs. Foster?" asked David Chen, her attorney, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the paperwork one final time. The young lawyer had handled her affairs for 3 years, ever since her previous attorney retired, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. Margaret smiled, the same warm expression that had calmed countless nervous AT-rolls on their first day of school. "David, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Every penny, every asset, it all goes to the Springfield Community Education Foundation." She thought of Robert, who would have understood completely. He'd always said she had enough love in her heart for every child in Illinois, and he'd been the one to encourage her teaching career when many husbands discouraged their wives from working. Even in retirement, she found herself drawn to young people, volunteering at the library's literacy program and helping with homework assistance at the community center. David nodded reluctantly and handed her the pen. As Margaret signed her name with careful strokes, she could hear her late husband Robert's voice echoing in her memory. "Maggie, you always did have the biggest heart in Illinois." Robert had been gone for 8 years now, and their children, well, they had their own lives, their own priorities. The doorbell chimed, interrupting her thoughts. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see her daughter Linda's BMW idling in the driveway, engine running as if she couldn't wait to leave. "Mom, we need to talk," Linda announced as she burst through the front door, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. At 45, Linda had inherited her father's sharp features, but none of his warmth. Her power suit was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair styled to corporate perfection. She worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical company and hadn't missed an opportunity to remind Margaret how much money she made. Behind Linda came Margaret's son Paul, 38, and perpetually disheveled despite his engineering salary. His receding hairline was damp from the rain, and he clutched his smartphone like a lifeline. Paul lived just 20 minutes away but visited maybe 3 times a year, usually when he needed something. As a child, he'd been curious and creative, building elaborate structures with blocks and asking endless questions about how things worked. But somewhere along the way, that wonder had been replaced by anxiety and a constant focus on financial security that bordered on obsession. Margaret often wondered if she'd failed him somehow, if her emphasis on education and service had made him feel inadequate rather than inspired. "Hello, David," Linda said curtly, barely acknowledging the attorney. "I assume you're here about, Mom, single quotes, decision." Linda had always been the more aggressive of Margaret's to children, even as a toddler demanding her way and throwing tantrums when thwarted. Success in pharmaceutical sales had only amplified these traits, turning her into someone who saw every interaction as a negotiation to be one. She'd inherited her father's intelligence but channeled it toward personal advancement rather than service to others. "The paperwork is complete," David replied diplomatically, gathering his documents. "Mrs. Foster has made her wishes very clear." Paul scoffed, not bothering to lower his voice. "Clear? Mom, you're giving away Dad's life insurance, the house, everything we've built as a family. Do you understand what you're doing?" Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced during parent-teacher conferences when dealing with particularly difficult parents. "I understand perfectly, Paul. I'm ensuring my money goes where it can do the most good." She'd learned long ago that some conversations required patience and gentle persistence, the same skills she'd used when helping struggling students master difficult concepts. But with her own children, those teaching instincts often felt inadequate against their adult stubbornness and self-interest. "Most good," Linda's voice rose an octave. "Mom, we're your children. Karen needs money for college and Paul's mortgage is underwater, but you're giving our inheritance to strangers?" "The Springfield Community Education Foundation helps children who have nothing," Margaret said quietly. "Children whose parents work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Children who dream of college but can't afford to dream." Linda rolled her eyes and turned to David. "Is there any way to contest this? I mean, Mom's 72. Has anyone evaluated her mental state recently?" David's expression hardened. "Your mother is completely competent, Miss Foster. I've worked with her extensively and her capacity is unquestionable. After David left, Linda and Paul remained in the kitchen, their voices carrying through the thin walls as Margaret prepared tea. She could hear every word, and each one cut deeper than the last. The house that had once been filled with laughter during family holidays and birthday celebrations now felt hollow, echoing with the disappointing realization that her children saw her life's work as worthless sentimentality. "She's lost her mind," Linda hissed. 30 years of teaching 8-year-olds, and now she thinks she can save the world. "The Community Education Foundation," Paul snorted. "I looked them up online. It's barely even a real charity. Some feel-good project that probably helps 50 kids a year, max. Mom's throwing away $200,000 on a hobby." $200,000? That should be ours," Linda added bitterly. "I've been planning to use that money to expand my territory at work. Karen's SAT tutor alone costs $3,000. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured hot water over her chamomile tea bags. Karen was Linda's 16-year-old daughter, Margaret's granddaughter, who attended an elite private school and had never wanted for anything. The irony wasn't lost on her. Karen had every educational advantage money could buy, including SAT tutors, college consultants, and summer enrichment programs, while the students Margaret helped through her foundation often worked part-time jobs just to afford school supplies. Yet Linda couldn't see the connection between her daughter's privileges and other children's struggles. "Maybe we should stage an intervention," Paul suggested. "Get her examined by a psychiatrist. There has to be something wrong with her judgment, or we wait," Linda said coldly. "She's 72. How much longer can she really have? Maybe the charity thing is just a phase." Margaret closed her eyes, letting their words wash over her like the rain outside. They had no idea. No idea about the late nights she'd spent over the past 15 years, carefully researching scholarship recipients, writing recommendation letters, and quietly funding dreams. No idea about the dozens of thank you cards hidden in her bedroom drawer, written by grateful students who'd graduated from colleges they never thought they could afford. When Linda and Paul finally left, their parting words stung with false sweetness. "We love you, Mom," Linda called over her shoulder. "We just want what's best for you." "Yeah, Mom," Paul added. "Maybe think about this some more." "Okay, you can always change your mind." Margaret watched their cars disappear into the rainy night, their taillights fading like dying embers. She knew they'd be on the phone within minutes, probably calling Linda's husband Steve and Paul's wife Jennifer, spreading their version of the story. By tomorrow, her decision would be family gossip, discussed over dinner tables with the same dismissive tone they'd used to describe a neighbor's peculiar gardening habits. But Margaret had a secret that none of them suspected. The Springfield Community Education Foundation wasn't just some small-town charity she'd picked at random. She had founded it herself 17 years ago, using the life insurance money from Robert's death as seed funding. What started as a modest scholarship program for 3 local students had grown into something extraordinary. Robert had always believed in her vision, even when others thought her idealistic. "Maggie," he'd say during their evening walks around the neighborhood, "you see potential where others see problems. That's your gift." His death had been devastating, but it had also freed her to pursue her educational mission with single-minded dedication. Over the years, Margaret had quietly reinvested every penny of her teacher's pension, every inheritance from deceased relatives, every gift and bonus into the foundation. She'd worked with guidance counselors at underfunded high schools, identifying bright students whose families couldn't afford college applications, let alone tuition. She'd funded SAT prep courses, college visits, and laptop computers. She'd even paid for interview clothes and transportation to campus visits. Margaret remembered the first student she'd helped, Maria Santos, whose mother cleaned offices at night and whose father worked construction during the day. Maria had wanted to be a teacher but couldn't afford the application fees for state universities. Margaret had not only paid those fees but also covered Maria's dorm deposits and textbooks. Maria was now a principal herself, running programs to help other first-generation college students succeed. The foundation now had assets worth over $400,000, not including her estate donation. In 17 years, it had helped 847 students attend college, with a graduation rate of 86%. Many of those graduates now worked as teachers, nurses, engineers, and social workers, making their own communities better. Some had even started scholarship funds of their own, creating a ripple effect of generosity that Margaret found deeply satisfying. She kept detailed records of every student's progress, celebrating each graduation, each job promotion, each wedding announcement and birth announcement that arrived in her mailbox. But the foundation operated quietly, deliberately staying below the radar. Margaret preferred it that way. She'd seen too many charitable organizations become more focused on publicity than impact. The Springfield Community Education Foundation had no galas, no celebrity endorsements, no glossy brochures, just results. Margaret finished her tea and walked to her bedroom, where she kept a special filing cabinet locked away from prying eyes. Inside were hundreds of letters from students she'd helped, photos from graduation ceremonies she'd quietly attended, and newspaper clippings about young people who'd gone on to change their communities tomorrow. She had an appointment with Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7 News. Rebecca had been one of her scholarship recipients. 12 years ago, a bright girl from a family of migrant workers who'd graduated from Northwestern with a degree in journalism. Rebecca had reached out a month ago, wanting to do a feature story about unsung heroes in education. Margaret had initially declined the interview, but something about Linda and Paul's reaction tonight made her reconsider. Maybe it was time for the Springfield Community Education Foundation to step into the light. Maybe it was time for her family to understand that their naive, senile mother had actually built something remarkable. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to Rebecca. "I've changed my mind about the interview. Let's talk." As Margaret typed those words, she felt a shift in her chest. Not the familiar tightness of disappointment, but the lightness of decision. For 17 years, she'd worked in the shadows, content to let her scholarship recipients shine while she remained anonymous. But perhaps it was time to step into the light, not for personal recognition, but to show the world what quiet determination could accomplish. And perhaps it was time for her family to learn that their naive, senile mother had actually built something that would outlast them all. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next. Margaret Foster had planted seeds for 17 years, tending them with the same care she'd once given to struggling readers in her third-grade classroom. Tomorrow, the harvest would finally begin, and the world would discover what happened when one determined teacher decided that every child deserved a chance to bloom. The Channel 7 news van pulled up to Margaret's house at exactly 9 a.m., its satellite dish gleaming in the morning sunlight that had finally broken through yesterday's storm clouds. Margaret had been awake since 5, organizing photo albums and documents, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Rebecca Martinez stepped out of the van, her professional smile warming into something genuine the moment she saw Margaret. At 34, Rebecca had kept her promise to stay connected with the woman who'd changed her life, sending Christmas cards and occasional updates about her career progression from weekend anchor to lead investigative reporter. Rebecca's success story was typical of Margaret's scholarship recipients, not just academic achievement, but a commitment to giving back to their communities. She'd covered stories about education, inequality, immigration issues, and social justice, always remembering the teacher who'd believed in her potential when no one else did. "Mrs. Foster," Rebecca said, embracing her former benefactor, "you look wonderful. Please, call me Margaret. You're not 19 anymore, asking for scholarship money?" Margaret laughed, leading Rebecca into the living room she'd carefully prepared for the interview. Rebecca's cameraman, Tony, began setting up equipment, while Rebecca reviewed her notes. "I have to admit, Margaret, I'm curious why you changed your mind about going public. For 12 years you've insisted on staying anonymous." Margaret settled into her favorite armchair, the same one where she'd graded thousands of papers and written hundreds of recommendation letters. The chair had been Robert's originally, but after his death, she'd claimed it as her own workspace, surrounded by the tools of her educational mission: stacks of college catalogs, scholarship applications, and files documenting the progress of her students. The chair held memories of late nights spent researching financial aid programs and early mornings writing letters of support for young people whose dreams exceeded their resources. "Sometimes circumstances force your hand. Dear, my family seems to think I've lost my mind." As Tony adjusted the lighting, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Mom, heard there's a news van at your house. What's going on? Call me immediately." The urgency in Linda's message amused Margaret. Her daughter, who rarely called except to complain about Margaret's lifestyle choices, was suddenly very interested in her activities. Margaret imagined Linda at her office, frantically Googling news stories and worrying about how her mother's behavior might reflect on her professional reputation. Margaret silenced her phone with a slight smile. "Let them wonder." "So tell me about the Springfield Community Education Foundation," Rebecca began, once the cameras were rolling. "Our research shows it's helped hundreds of students over the years, but there's very little public information available." "That was intentional," Margaret said, her voice clear and confident. "I founded the organization 17 years ago, shortly after my husband Robert passed away. His life insurance money became our first scholarship fund." Margaret's throat tightened slightly as she spoke about Robert. Even after 8 years, mentioning him brought both sadness and strength. He'd been her partner in everything, the one person who'd truly understood her passion for teaching and her belief that education could transform lives. When he died suddenly of a heart attack, Margaret had channeled her grief into purpose. Using his legacy to help young people achieve their dreams, Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. She'd known Margaret was connected to the foundation, but she hadn't realized the depth of that connection. "You founded it. But all these years you never mentioned, because it wasn't about me," Margaret interrupted gently. "It was about young people like you, Rebecca. Brilliant minds trapped in circumstances beyond their control." Margaret opened the first photo album, revealing pictures from graduation ceremonies spanning nearly 2 decades. "This is Marcus Thompson. His father worked 2 jobs at minimum wage. Marcus is now a pediatric surgeon in Chicago. And this is Sarah Kim, whose family immigrated from Korea with nothing. She's a software engineer at Google." Each photograph told a story of transformation, of potential unlocked through opportunity. Rebecca's camera captured every detail as Margaret narrated the journey of the foundation's growth. Behind each smiling face was a story of struggle overcome, of families who'd sacrificed everything to support their children's education, of young people who'd worked multiple jobs while maintaining perfect GPAs, determined to honor the investment that had been made in their futures. Margaret knew these stories intimately because she'd lived them alongside each student, offering not just financial support but mentorship, encouragement, and the kind of unwavering belief that could sustain someone through the most challenging academic demands. "We started with 3 scholarships the first year," Margaret continued, turning pages filled with smiling faces. "By year 5, we were helping 30 students annually. Now we assist over 60 new students each year, plus ongoing support for previous recipients. The financial commitment must be enormous," Rebecca observed. Margaret's eyes twinkled with the same mischief that had once helped her manage classroom troublemakers. "Every penny of my teacher's pension for 17 years, every inheritance from my sister Ruth, my brother William, every Christmas bonus, every tax refund. I calculated once that I've personally contributed over $300,000 to the foundation." She paused, remembering the discipline it had required to live so simply while her friends and colleagues enjoyed comfortable retirements. There had been times when she'd been tempted to take a vacation or buy a new car, but the satisfaction of helping another student always outweighed any temporary desire for personal luxury. "And yesterday you signed over your entire estate? Another $200,000, approximately? The house, my savings, everything." Margaret's voice carried no regret, only satisfaction. "My children think I'm throwing money away on strangers. They don't understand that these strangers have become my legacy." Rebecca leaned forward, her journalistic instincts sensing there was more to this story. "What don't they understand, Margaret?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a graduation photo. "They see charity as money leaving the family. I see it as money returning to the community that supported me for 40 years. Every student we've helped has given back. As teachers, doctors, social workers, engineers, they're solving problems, creating jobs, raising families with values of service and gratitude." She thought about the ripple effects that were impossible to quantify, the patients saved by doctors she'd helped educate, the children inspired by teachers she'd supported through college, the innovations created by engineers who might never have had the chance to develop their talents without financial assistance. "Can you give me specific examples?" Margaret's face lit up as she opened another album. Dr. Alina Rodriguez. Her parents cleaned office buildings at night so she could focus on studying. She's now running a free clinic in the poorest part of Springfield, serving families who can't afford health care. Or James Patterson, his mother was a single parent working at the grocery store. He's now a high school principal, implementing programs to help at-risk students. Margaret could have continued for hours, telling stories of transformed lives and communities made stronger by the success of young people who'd been given opportunities to thrive. Each graduate represented not just individual achievement, but collective progress toward a more equitable society. The interview continued for 2 hours, with Margaret sharing story after story of transformed lives. She showed Rebecca the filing cabinet filled with thank you letters, each one a testament to the ripple effects of her quiet generosity. Some letters were written on expensive stationery by successful professionals. Others were handwritten notes on notebook paper from students still in college. But all carried the same message of gratitude and commitment to paying forward the opportunities they'd received. Margaret treasured these letters more than any financial investment return, because they represented something money couldn't buy, the knowledge that her life had made a lasting difference. "There's something else," Margaret said as they wrapped up the formal interview. "Something I haven't told my family yet." Rebecca gestured for Tony to keep rolling. "The Springfield Community Education Foundation has received a matching grant from the Kellogg Foundation. They've been quietly observing our work for 3 years. Next month, they're announcing a $1 million endowment that will make our scholarships permanent. Rebecca's jaw dropped. $1 million. Margaret, this is incredible news. It gets better, Margaret continued, her smile growing wider. The Kellogg Foundation wants to use our model as a template for similar programs in 20 other communities across the Midwest. They're calling it the Foster Model of Community-Based Education Support. Tony, behind the camera, mouthed, "Wow." As he continued filming, "My family thinks I'm giving away their inheritance to help a few random kids," Margaret said, looking directly into the camera. "What they don't realize is that I've built something that will help thousands of kids for generations to come. The foster model will outlive me, outlive my children, outlive all of us." As the interview concluded, Rebecca shook her head in amazement. "Margaret, this is going to be huge news. Are you prepared for the attention this will bring?" Margaret looked out her window toward the high school where she'd taught for 3 decades, where hundreds of her former students now lived as productive adults throughout the community. "Rebecca, I've spent 17 years hiding my light under a bushel, as the Bible says. Maybe it's time to let it shine." After the news crew left, Margaret's phone exploded with missed calls and text messages. Linda had called 6 times. Paul had texted, "What is going on?" in all caps. Even her granddaughter Karen had sent a message. "Grandma, my friends are saying you're going to be on the news." But Margaret didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she drove to the Springfield Community Education Foundation's small office. Really, just a converted classroom in an old building near downtown? Her assistant director, Maria Santos, was waiting with a stack of new scholarship applications. "Mrs. Foster," Maria said excitedly, "we've received 42 new applications. Just this morning, word is spreading that something big is happening." Margaret smiled as she looked through the applications. Each one represented a dream, deferred by economic circumstances, a bright mind waiting for opportunity. Tomorrow, when Rebecca's story aired, those dreams would move one step closer to reality. But tonight, Margaret had one more surprise to prepare. Something that would ensure her family finally understood the magnitude of what she'd accomplished, and why their mockery had only strengthened her resolve to leave a legacy that truly mattered. Rebecca Martinez's investigative report aired on Channel 7's Evening News at exactly 6 p.m. with the headline, "Local Teacher's Secret, 17-Year Mission Transforms Hundreds of Lives." But by 6:30 p.m., the story had been picked up by the regional affiliate networks across Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. By 8 p.m., it was trending on social media platforms from Twitter to Facebook to TikTok. With hashtags like #TeacherHero and #SpringfieldMiracle gaining momentum, by midnight, national news outlets were calling Margaret's house, leaving voicemails from producers at CNN, ABC, NBC, and Fox News, all clamoring for exclusive follow-up interviews with the woman who'd quietly revolutionized community philanthropy. Margaret sat in her living room watching her phone light up with notifications while CNN played her story on the television. Anderson Cooper himself was discussing the remarkable educator from Illinois who quietly revolutionized community philanthropy, his silver hair gleaming under the studio lights as he gestured toward a graphic showing the foundation's impressive statistics. The surreal experience of watching herself become a national news story felt both overwhelming and vindicating after 17 years of working in anonymity. The magnitude of her accomplishment was finally being recognized by the broader world. "This is extraordinary." Anderson's voice filled the room. Margaret Foster didn't just donate to charity, she created a sustainable model that's now being replicated nationwide. The Kellogg Foundation calls it the most effective grassroots education initiative they've ever encountered. Meanwhile, across town, Linda Foster Harrison was having a very different evening. She'd been in the middle of dinner with her husband, Steve, and daughter Karen when her phone started buzzing with texts from colleagues, friends, and neighbors. The notifications came so rapidly that her phone seemed to be vibrating continuously. Messages from her pharmaceutical company colleagues, her college sorority sisters, her country club friends, and even acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know if the Margaret Foster on television was really her mother. The irony wasn't lost on Steve, who'd listened to Linda complain about her eccentric mother's charitable giving for years. "Mom, isn't that great-grandma Margaret on TV?" Karen asked, pointing at the screen where Margaret's interview was being replayed for the 3rd time that evening. Linda nearly choked on her wine. There was her mother, looking dignified and articulate, explaining the intricacies of a charitable foundation that Linda had dismissed as a hobby just 24 hours earlier. The woman on television bore little resemblance to the naive, out-of-touch elderly person Linda had described to her husband and colleagues. Instead, Margaret appeared confident, knowledgeable, and remarkably sharp as she discussed complex educational policy issues and demonstrated an impressive command of statistics and outcomes data that would rival any corporate executive's presentation. She founded it, Steve asked, reaching for the remote to turn up the volume. Linda, did you know about this? Of course not, Linda snapped, but her face was burning with embarrassment. Yesterday, she'd called her mother senile and out of touch. Now that same mother was being hailed as a visionary philanthropist by national news outlets. Linda's phone rang. It was her boss, Janet Morrison, the regional vice president. Linda, Janet's voice was unusually warm. I just saw the most amazing story about your mother on the news. We had no idea you came from such an inspiring family. The board of directors is very impressed. There's talk of featuring your family's philanthropic legacy in our next corporate social responsibility report. This could be wonderful for your career trajectory. Having a family connection to such meaningful community work really demonstrates the kind of values our company wants to promote. The conversation that had started as a casual compliment was quickly revealing itself as a potential professional opportunity, the kind Linda had always been quick to recognize and exploit. Oh yes, Linda managed weakly. We're very proud of Mom. I'd love to meet her, Janet continued. Perhaps we could arrange a corporate donation to her foundation. This could be wonderful publicity for our company's community involvement initiatives. After hanging up, Linda stared at her phone in shock. In less than 3 hours, her mother had gone from family embarrassment to corporate asset. The same woman Linda had suggested needed psychiatric evaluation was now being hailed as a visionary leader whose work could enhance her daughter's professional reputation. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. How had she so completely misjudged her own mother's capabilities and accomplishments? More troubling was the realization that Margaret had been building this remarkable legacy for 17 years while Linda remained completely oblivious to its scope and significance. 3 miles away, Paul Foster was having an equally jarring experience. His engineering firm's group chat was exploding with messages about Paul's amazing mom and requests for introductions to the foundation. His project manager, Rodriguez, had sent a private message. Paul, man, your mom is incredible. My nephew could really use help with college funding. Think she'd talk to our family? I had no idea you came from such a service-oriented background. This explains so much about your character. The compliments felt hollow to Paul, who knew he'd inherited none of his mother's generosity or vision for community service. Paul's wife, Jennifer, was scrolling through Facebook, where Margaret's story had been shared over 2,000 times in their local community groups. The comments were overwhelmingly positive, people calling Margaret a local treasure, an unsung hero, and the kind of person who makes America great. Several comments specifically mentioned Paul and Linda, with neighbors expressing how proud they must be of their mother's incredible work. Jennifer felt increasingly uncomfortable as she read, remembering the disparaging comments she and Paul had made about Margaret's wasteful, charitable giving during their private conversations. Over the years, Paul, Jennifer said slowly, people are calling your mom a local hero and a saint. Did you really not know about any of this? Paul felt sick to his stomach remembering his words from the previous evening. Barely even a real charity. Some feel-good project that probably helps 50 kids a year. Margaret's foundation had helped 847 students. 847. The number haunted him as he realized the scope of his misjudgment. Each of those students represented a life transformed, a family lifted up, a community made stronger, and his mother had accomplished all of this while he'd been worrying about mortgage payments and retirement savings. The contrast between her vision and his self-absorption was humiliating. But the real shock came the next morning when Margaret's story went national. Good Morning America called at 6:15 a.m., The Today Show at 6:22 a.m. By 7 a.m., Margaret had received interview requests from CNN, NPR, The Washington Post, and People magazine. The story wasn't just about charitable giving anymore. It was about the Foster model of community philanthropy that was being hailed as revolutionary. Dr. Patricia Williams from the Kellogg Foundation appeared on Morning Joe to discuss their partnership with Margaret. Mrs. Foster has created something unprecedented, she explained to the MSNBC audience, her enthusiasm evident as she gestured to ward charts showing the foundation's remarkable success rates. Her foundation has an 86% college graduation rate among recipients. The national average is 60%. She's not just sending kids to college, she's ensuring they succeed through comprehensive support systems, mentorship programs, and ongoing guidance that extends throughout their academic careers. This holistic approach is what makes the Foster model so effective and scalable. Margaret's phone rang continuously. She'd unplugged her landline by 8 a.m. and put her cell phone on airplane mode by 9 a.m. But the media attention was overwhelming. News vans lined her street like a presidential motorcade. Reporters knocked on her door every few minutes, and neighbors had begun gathering on their front porches to watch the spectacle. The quiet residential street where Margaret had lived peacefully for 30 years had been transformed into a media circus, with satellite trucks blocking driveways and camera crews interviewing anyone willing to share memories of the remarkable woman next door. Finally, at 10:30 a.m., Linda and Paul arrived together, looking haggard and desperate. They'd been fielding calls and messages all morning, with Linda having to leave work early due to the constant interruptions from colleagues and clients wanting to discuss her famous mother. Paul had called in sick entirely, unable to concentrate on engineering projects while his phone buzzed with interview requests from local and national media outlets. Both siblings looked like they'd aged years overnight, the weight of their misjudgment and the sudden public attention taking a visible toll on their composure. "Mom," Linda said breathlessly as Margaret let them in through the back door to avoid the cameras, "we need to talk." "Now you want to talk?" Margaret observed mildly, leading them to the kitchen where she'd been calmly sipping coffee and reading thank you emails on her tablet. "Mom, this is incredible," Paul said, his voice strained. "We had no idea. Why didn't you tell us?" Margaret looked at her son with the same expression she'd used when catching students cheating on tests. "Paul, yesterday you called my foundation barely even a real charity. You suggested I needed psychiatric evaluation. You said I was throwing away money on strangers. Why would I share something precious with people who saw it as worthless?" Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with difficult behavior. But underneath was a pain that couldn't be entirely hidden. The wounds from their dismissive words were still fresh, made more painful by the realization that her own children had so little faith in her, judgment, and capabilities. Linda's face was red with shame and frustration. "We were worried about you. Giving away everything to strangers seemed crazy." Strangers. Margaret opened her tablet and began reading. "Let me tell you about some strangers. Linda. Dr. Marcus Thompson, the pediatric surgeon, performed heart surgery on 3 children just last week. Sarah Kim's software innovations have created jobs for 200 people. Elena Rodriguez's free clinic has provided healthcare to over 5,000 families who couldn't afford insurance." She continued reading names and accomplishments, each one hitting Linda and Paul like a physical blow. Dr. Michael Chen, whose parents worked in a restaurant kitchen, now heads the pediatric oncology program at Children's Hospital. Lisa Williams, whose single mother cleaned houses, is now a federal judge. Antonio Rodriguez, who grew up in public housing, developed software that's used in schools nationwide to help struggling readers. The list went on, each graduate representing not just individual success but systemic change that rippled through communities, creating better healthcare, education, and justice systems for everyone. Meanwhile, Margaret continued, "Yesterday you both complained that I wasn't giving you money, so Linda could expand her sales territory and Paul could pay down his mortgage. Tell me, which approach is helping more people?" Paul's phone buzzed, with yet another text from a colleague asking for an introduction to his amazing philanthropist mother. The irony was suffocating. "Mom," Linda said desperately, "people are asking me for interviews. Janet, my boss, wants to meet you. The company might want to make a major donation to your foundation, and suddenly you're interested in my hobby," Margaret said dryly. Linda's mask of composure finally cracked. "Look, we made a mistake. Okay, we didn't understand. But this is huge, Mom. You're famous. You could leverage this publicity to raise millions more for your cause." Margaret studied her daughter carefully. Even now, facing the magnitude of her mother's accomplishment, Linda was thinking about leverage, publicity, and personal advantage. "You're right," Margaret said finally. "This is an opportunity to raise more money for scholarships, which is why I've scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning." Paul and Linda exchanged glances, relief flooding their faces. "That's great, Mom," Paul said eagerly. "We'll be there to support you. Family should stick together during times like this." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. "Oh, you'll definitely want to be there. I have one more announcement to make, something I haven't shared with anyone yet." "What announcement?" Linda asked nervously. "You'll find out tomorrow," Margaret said, along with everyone else. As Linda and Paul left, promising to help manage the media attention and coordinate family support, Margaret watched them go with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated. They finally understood the scope of what she'd built. But another part felt deeply sad that it had taken national headlines for her own children to see her clearly that evening. Margaret's former students organized an impromptu celebration at the high school auditorium. Over 300 people showed up, students she'd taught, scholarship recipients from her foundation, parents whose children had benefited from her generosity, and community members who'd been quietly inspired by her work for years. As Margaret walked into the auditorium to thunderous applause, she realized something profound. Her real family had been surrounding her all along. These were the people who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in inheritance dollars, but in lives transformed and communities strengthened. Tomorrow's press conference would be the culmination of 17 years of quiet service. But tonight, surrounded by the people whose lives she'd touched, Margaret Foster felt richer than she'd ever imagined possible. The Springfield High School auditorium was packed beyond capacity for Margaret's press conference, with people standing in the aisles and spilling out into the hallway. Every major news outlet had sent representatives from local stations to CNN, ABC, NBC, who'd flown in specifically to cover what was being called the Springfield phenomenon. The crowd included dozens of scholarship recipients who'd traveled from across the country, their families, community leaders, Margaret's former teaching colleagues, and curious residents who wanted to witness history in the making. Linda and Paul sat in the front row with their spouses, having spent the morning giving interviews to reporters who were fascinated by the family angle of the story, though their discomfort was visible to anyone paying attention to their strained expressions and fidgeting hands. Margaret had chosen the high school auditorium deliberately, the same space where she'd attended countless graduation ceremonies. Watching her students receive diplomas and move on to build their own lives, the irony wasn't lost on her that she was now standing on the same stage, where she'd watched hundreds of her former third graders graduate, many of whom had gone on to become teachers, nurses, business owners, and community leaders themselves. The auditorium held decades of memories: spring concerts where nervous children had forgotten their lines, science fairs where young minds had displayed their curiosity about the world, and award ceremonies where she'd watched shy students blossom into confident young adults. Now, at 72, she was preparing to deliver the most important speech of her own life in the place, where she'd witnessed so many other important beginnings. She walked to the podium wearing her best navy blue dress, the same one she'd worn to retirement celebrations for colleagues over the years, 2 scholarship award ceremonies, and to the funerals of fellow educators who dedicated their lives to teaching. Her silver hair was arranged perfectly, and her eyes sparkled with the confidence of someone who had spent 4 decades commanding the attention of roomfuls of children, parents, and administrators. Despite the overwhelming media attention and the magnitude of the moment, Margaret felt calm and centered, drawing on the same inner strength that had helped her manage challenging students, difficult parents, and budget cuts that threatened programs she believed in. This was simply another teaching moment, albeit on a much larger scale than any classroom she'd ever managed. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. 3 days ago, most of you had never heard of the Springfield Community Education Foundation. Today, we're receiving donations from all 50 states and 12 countries. It's been quite a whirlwind. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, reporters with their notebooks ready, former students holding phones to record her words, community members who'd known her for decades but were seeing her in an entirely new light. The transformation from local retired teacher to national education advocate still felt surreal. But Margaret was determined to use this platform to advance the cause that had defined her life for nearly 2 decades. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. "I want to start by addressing something that's been mentioned in many of the news reports," Margaret continued. "The question of why I kept this work secret for so long, and why I chose to go public now." She looked directly at Linda and Paul, who were watching with carefully composed expressions. "The truth is, I didn't keep it secret. I simply didn't announce it to people who weren't interested in listening. For 17 years, I've shared this work with anyone who asked genuine questions about education, community service, or helping young people succeed. My family never asked those questions." She looked directly at Linda and Paul, who were watching with carefully composed expressions that couldn't quite hide their discomfort. Margaret's voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable note of sadness as she continued. The realization that her own children had shown so little curiosity about her passions and commitments was perhaps the most painful aspect of this entire experience, made more acute by the contrast with the hundreds of strangers who'd reached out to express admiration for her work. "Linda, 3 nights ago, my children visited my home after learning that I had donated my entire estate to charity. They were upset, which I understood. What hurt was their assumption that I was either senile or naive, that I couldn't possibly understand the value of what I was giving away." Margaret's voice remained steady, but the emotion underneath was unmistakable. Throwing away money on strangers, they had no curiosity about what the foundation actually did, who it served, or why it mattered to me. Paul's face was red with shame as reporters scribbled notes and cameras rolled, So I decided it was time to let the world know what those strangers have accomplished. Margaret opened a folder and began reading statistics that made the audience gasp with amazement. 86% graduation rate, 412 teachers, nurses, and social workers, 128 engineers and technology specialists, 94 business owners creating jobs in their communities. She paused between each number, letting the magnitude sink in. Behind each statistic was a human story. Young people who'd overcome poverty, discrimination, and family crises to achieve their dreams. Margaret could have named them all, could have told their individual stories of struggle and triumph, but the numbers themselves painted a picture of systematic change that no anecdotal evidence could match. She paused to let the numbers sink. In these, strangers have collectively earned over $42 million in additional lifetime income because of their college educations. They've paid over $6 million in federal taxes. They've created an estimated 1,200 jobs. They've served over 30,000 people through their professional work. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she recited these figures, each number representing a return on investment that far exceeded anything Wall Street could offer. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual success stories. These graduates were building stronger communities, raising children with values of service and gratitude. The applause was thunderous. But Margaret wasn't finished revealing the full scope of what her quiet revolution had accomplished. The applause was thunderous, but Margaret wasn't finished. But today, I'm not here just to celebrate what we've accomplished. I'm here to announce what comes next. Margaret smiled, the same expression she'd worn when revealing surprise field trips to her third-grade classes. Yesterday, I received a call from the MacArthur Foundation. They've awarded me a fellowship, what many people call a genius grant, specifically for developing the Foster model of community philanthropy. The announcement hit the auditorium like an earthquake. MacArthur Fellowships were among the most prestigious awards in America. Just past achievements, but future potential to create lasting change. Margaret had joined the ranks of Nobel Prize winners, groundbreaking artists, and visionary scientists who'd received this ultimate recognition of their contributions to society. The audience erupted in sustained applause that lasted nearly 2 minutes. People were on their feet, some wiping away tears, others taking photos and videos to share on social media. Margaret's former students were shouting congratulations, and even the typically reserved reporters were clapping enthusiastically. Linda's mouth fell open so wide that a photographer captured the moment for what would become an iconic image of family shock and recognition. Paul looked like he might faint, his engineering mind struggling to process that his naive mother had achieved one of the highest honors available to American intellectuals and innovators. The fellowship comes with a stipend of $25,000 over 5 years, Margaret continued, once the applause died down. Money I plan to donate entirely to expand the Foster model to 50 additional communities. Reporters were frantically taking notes as Margaret revealed the full scope of her recognition. Additionally, the Kellogg Foundation has increased their commitment. Instead of 20 communities, they're now funding the Foster model in 100 communities across all 50 states. The total commitment is $8.5 million. The number hit the auditorium like a physical force, causing gasps and murmurs of amazement throughout the crowd. Margaret Foster, the retired elementary school teacher, whom her own children had mocked as naive just days earlier, had triggered an $8.5 million national education initiative that would transform communities from coast to coast. Education policy experts in the audience were furiously taking notes, realizing they were witnessing the announcement of one of the largest grassroots education reforms in American history. The number hit the auditorium like a physical force. Margaret Foster, the retired elementary school teacher whom her own children had mocked as naive, had triggered an $8.5 million national education initiative. But here's what I want everyone to understand, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. This isn't about me being special or brilliant. This is about what happens when you listen to your community, when you pay attention to young people who just need someone to believe in them, and when you're willing to invest in solutions rather than just complaining about problems. She looked out at the faces in the audience, many of them young people whose lives had been changed by her foundation. For 17 years, I lived on Social Security and spent my pension helping kids go to college. I drove a car, shopped at thrift stores, and ate dinner at home every night. My family worried that I was depriving myself, but I never felt deprived. Every letter from a graduating student, every photo from a wedding of someone I'd helped, every announcement of a new job or promotion, those were my dividends. Margaret paused, gathering her thoughts for what she wanted to say next. I understand why my family was confused by my choices. In our culture, we're taught that financial security means accumulating assets for our descendants, but I believe true security comes from building communities where everyone's children can thrive. She gestured toward the audience, where dozens of her scholarship recipients sat with their own families. These young people aren't just strangers. I helped. They're my investment in the future. When Dr. Rodriguez treats patients at her free clinic, when teacher Patterson mentors at-risk students, when engineer Kim develops technology that creates jobs, they're generating returns on my investment that no stock portfolio could match. The applause was sustained now, building as people began to understand the full magnitude of what Margaret had accomplished. But Margaret held up her hand. She had one final surprise. There's one more thing, she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Something I haven't told anyone, including the reporters who've been calling all week. The auditorium fell silent. Last year, I was diagnosed with a mild heart condition. Nothing immediately dangerous, but it reminded me that I won't live forever. So I've been working with my attorney to establish something permanent. Linda and Paul leaned forward, suddenly anxious. I'm establishing the Margaret and Robert Foster Endowment for Community Education, the MacArthur Fellowship money, plus matching. Funds from several major donors who've reached out this week will create a permanent fund of over $2 million. The crowd was hanging on every word. The endowment will be managed by a board of trustees, all former scholarship recipients who've gone on to successful careers. They'll ensure that the Foster model continues operating in Springfield and expanding to new communities for generations to come. Margaret's voice grew emotional as she reached her conclusion. My children worried that I was giving away their inheritance. What I've actually done is create an inheritance for thousands of children who haven't even been born yet. Children who will grow up in communities where education is valued, where potential is recognized, and where financial circumstances don't determine life outcomes. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. When it finally subsided, reporters began shouting questions, but Margaret gestured toward Linda and Paul. I know many of you want to speak with my family, she said. They've been very supportive once they understood the scope of this work. As Margaret stepped away from the podium, Linda and Paul found themselves surrounded by microphones and cameras. After 3 days of trying to position themselves as supportive family members, they were being asked direct questions about their initial reaction to their mother's decision. We're incredibly proud of our mother, Linda managed, her voice tight. With strain, her vision and generosity have created something truly remarkable. Did you know about the foundation's impact before this week? A reporter asked pointedly. Paul and Linda exchanged glances, both realizing that dozens of cameras were recording their every expression. We knew our mother was passionate about education, Paul said carefully, but we didn't fully understand the scope of her work until recently. The questions continued, each one more difficult than the last. How did it feel to learn about their mother's recognition through news reports? Were they surprised by the MacArthur Fellowship? Did they regret their initial concerns about the estate donation? Meanwhile, Margaret was surrounded by scholarship recipients, community leaders, and reporters who wanted to hear more about the Foster model's expansion plans. She was in her element, discussing educational outcomes and community partnerships with the expertise of someone who'd spent decades thinking deeply about these issues. As the press conference wound down, Linda and Paul approached their mother. Looking overwhelmed and humbled by the magnitude of what they'd witnessed, they'd been fielding questions from reporters all day, trying to explain their initial reaction to their mother's estate donation, while maintaining some semblance of family dignity. The contrast between their dismissive comments from 3 days earlier and the national recognition Margaret was receiving made every interview an exercise in damage control. Both siblings had aged visibly under the pressure, their confident corporate personas cracking under the weight of public scrutiny and personal shame. Mom, Linda said quietly, we owe you an apology. More than an apology, Paul added. We were wrong about everything. We're sorry. Margaret looked at her children with compassion, but also with the clear-eyed assessment of an experienced teacher who'd seen countless students make mistakes and hopefully learn from them. I accept your apology, she said, but I want you to understand something. This week you've seen me get national recognition and prestigious awards. Suddenly you're proud to be my children. But I was doing this same work last year. 5 years ago, the work was just as important then, even when nobody was paying attention. Her words carried the weight of 17 years spent building something meaningful. While her own family dismissed her efforts as the eccentric hobby of an aging woman who didn't understand the real world, Linda and Paul nodded, both understanding the deeper lesson their mother was teaching. The question is, Margaret continued, what are you going to do with this understanding? How will you use your own resources and influence to make your communities better? It was a challenge that would follow them long after the cameras stopped rolling and the reporters went home as the auditorium emptied. Margaret stood alone on the stage where she'd watched so many of her students graduate over the years. Tomorrow, the media attention would fade, and she'd return to the quiet work of reading scholarship applications and writing recommendation letters. But today had changed everything. Her family finally understood her values. Her community knew that extraordinary things could happen when ordinary people committed to serving others, and across the country, the foster model would help thousands of young people transform their lives through education. Margaret Foster had spent 17 years planting seeds in secret. Now the whole world could see the forest she'd grown, one student at a time, one scholarship at a time, one transformed life at a time. At 72, she'd proven that the most powerful inheritance you can leave isn't money in a bank account. It's a legacy of service that keeps growing long after you're gone. And unlike a traditional inheritance that gets smaller each time, it's divided. Margaret's legacy would multiply with each life it touched. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Margaret's kitchen as she sat at the same table, where she'd signed away her estate just 6 months earlier. The house was quieter now. The media attention had faded. The reporters had moved on to other stories, and life had settled into a new rhythm that felt both familiar and completely transformed. The kitchen itself had become something of a shrine to her work, with framed photos of scholarship recipients covering every available surface and thank you letters, organized in neat stacks across the counters. But the kitchen table was busier than ever. Spread across its surface were scholarship applications from 12 states, thank you letters from recent graduates, quarterly reports from the 57 communities that had now implemented the foster model, and correspondence from education officials in 3 countries who wanted to adapt her approach to their own systems. Margaret's reading glasses had become a permanent fixture, perched on her nose as she reviewed applications with the same careful attention she'd once given to spelling tests and book reports. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Martinez, happy to report that the Springfield Story just won a Peabody Award for Excellence in Journalism. The documentary about your work will air on PBS next month. Thank you for trusting me with your story. Margaret smiled, remembering how nervous she'd been about that first interview. Worried that she might somehow misrepresent the students and families who'd entrusted her with their dreams. Now she regularly spoke at education conferences, consulted with other communities starting their own foundations, served on the MacArthur Foundation's advisory board for community philanthropy initiatives, and had become an unofficial spokesperson for grassroots education reform. The front door opened, and Linda walked in carrying a box of files and wearing an expression of focused determination that Margaret barely recognized. The sharp-edged corporate executive who'd once dismissed her mother's work had been replaced by someone who radiated purpose and genuine commitment to service. "Morning, Mom," Linda said, setting the box on the counter with the careful reverence of someone handling precious cargo. "I brought the applications from the pharmaceutical company's scholarship program. We've received over 300 applications for the 20 spots we're offering this year." Linda paused, her voice softening with emotion. "Mom, some of these stories, they're just incredible. I don't know how you've been reading applications like this for 17 years without your heart breaking every single day." 6 months ago, Linda's embarrassment about her misjudgment had transformed into genuine commitment that surprised everyone who knew her. She'd convinced her company to establish their own scholarship fund, modeled after Margaret's foundation, specifically for children of healthcare workers, janitors, and other support staff whose families often struggled financially despite working in well-funded institutions. Linda now spent her evenings reviewing applications, her weekends visiting high schools and underserved communities, and her lunch breaks mentoring teenage girls who reminded her of her younger self, ambitious and driven but lacking the connections and resources that had made her own success possible. "Any promising candidates?" Margaret asked, gesturing for Linda to join her at the table that had become command central for their expanding educational mission. "There's a young woman from East St. Louis whose mother works as a hospital janitor." During the night shift, Linda said, pulling out a file with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "She wants to study biochemistry and develop affordable medications for diabetes." Her essay about watching her grandmother ration insulin because of the cost made me cry for 20 minutes. She's maintained a 4.0 GPA while working weekends at a grocery store to help pay family bills. Margaret noticed how Linda's voice had changed when discussing the scholarship recipients. The sharp, corporate tone that had once characterized every conversation had softened into something warmer, more personal, more human. Success in pharmaceutical sales had taught Linda to see customers as revenue opportunities, but this work was teaching her to see potential instead of just profit margins, to measure success in transformed lives rather than quarterly earnings reports. Paul arrived 20 minutes later, as he did every Saturday morning now, carrying his laptop and wearing the kind of enthusiasm Margaret hadn't seen from him since he was a child, building elaborate structures with blocks. He'd taken early retirement from his engineering firm to work full-time for the Springfield Community Education Foundation, managing the technology systems that tracked student progress and outcomes across all the foster model communities. His analytical mind had found new purpose in measuring impact rather than just structural integrity. "Mom, you need to see this," Paul said, opening his laptop with the excitement of someone who'd discovered something remarkable. "The data from our first year of expansion is incredible. I've been running analysis all week, and the results are beyond anything we projected." On the screen was a comprehensive dashboard showing metrics from communities across the country, color-coded maps displaying graduation rates, and graphs tracking long-term outcomes that would have impressed any corporate boardroom. College enrollment rates were up an average of 34% in foster model communities. High school graduation rates had improved by 12%. Most remarkably, the communities were reporting increased civic engagement, with scholarship recipients returning to volunteer in their hometowns at rates far above national averages, creating a cycle of service that strengthens social fabric in ways that traditional economic development programs rarely achieved. "It's not just about individual success anymore," Paul explained, his engineer's mind delighting in the patterns the data revealed. "We're seeing systemic change. Communities are becoming more resilient, more connected, more hopeful. The kids we help aren't just succeeding academically, they're becoming community leaders, starting their own nonprofits, mentoring other students. It's like we've created a positive feedback loop that keeps generating benefits." Margaret studied the numbers, but her attention was drawn to a different kind of data. The framed photos that now covered her refrigerator like badges of honor. Dr. Marcus Thompson had sent a picture from his wedding, where he'd honored Margaret. In his speech as the person who'd made his medical career possible, Sarah Kim had mailed a photo of her new baby, with a note explaining that she'd started a college fund using Margaret's model and was already planning to establish a scholarship program at her tech company. Elena Rodriguez had included a picture of her free clinic's expansion, funded entirely by donations from other scholarship recipients who'd achieved financial success and wanted to give back to their community. "There's something else," Paul said, his voice carrying a hint of the excitement he'd once reserved for discussing breakthrough engineering solutions. "The Gates Foundation called yesterday. They want to fund a comprehensive study of the foster model's long-term impact. If the results confirm what we're seeing in the preliminary data, they're considering a $50 million commitment to expand the program internationally." $50 million, Mom. Can you imagine what that could do? Margaret set down her coffee cup, momentarily stunned by the magnitude of what her small-town idea had become. $50 million? Can you imagine, Mom? Linda said, her eyes bright with possibilities that extended far beyond personal gain. "Your idea could help kids in dozens of countries. We could be looking at systematic education reform on a global scale. The State Department has already reached out about potentially incorporating the foster model into foreign aid programs." Margaret looked at her children, really looked at them, and saw people she almost didn't recognize. 6 months ago, they'd been focused on their own financial security, worried about inheritances and mortgages and retirement planning. Now they were talking about global impact and systemic change with the passion of true believers, using phrases like social return on investment and community resilience with the same fluency they'd once reserved for corporate jargon and quarterly projections. "You know what this means, don't you?" Margaret said quietly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Paul and Linda looked at her expectantly, both leaning forward as if waiting for another revelation that would reshape their understanding of what was possible. "It means we're going to need a bigger kitchen table." They laughed together, but Margaret's joke carried a deeper truth that all three of them understood. The work that had started as her private mission had become a family legacy in ways she'd never imagined possible. Not because she'd left them money in a traditional inheritance, but because she'd shown them a different way to measure wealth, success, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. Her phone rang, another reporter, wanting to do a follow-up story about the Springfield Miracle and its expanding influence on education policy nationwide. Margaret let it go to voicemail, having learned to be selective about media attention, focusing on interviews that would genuinely help expand the foster model rather than just celebrating her personal story. Fame had never been the goal. Transformation was. "I should head home," Linda said, gathering her files with the care of someone handling important documents rather than routine paperwork. "Steve and I are taking Karen to visit 3 colleges this weekend. She's decided she wants to study education policy and nonprofit management." Margaret raised an eyebrow, intrigued by this development. "Karen wants to be a teacher. She wants to be a reformer," Linda corrected with obvious pride. She says, watching you proved that one person with a good idea and enough determination can change everything. She wants to study how to scale effective programs and influence policy at the federal level. I think she's planning to run for office someday. The transformation of her granddaughter's ambitions felt like the ultimate validation of everything Margaret had worked to achieve. Karen, who'd grown up with every privilege, was choosing a path of service over personal enrichment, inspired by her great-grandmother's example of quiet but persistent change-making. After Linda and Paul left, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of what her quiet revolution had become. Tomorrow, she'd drive to the high school for the Foundation's weekly mentoring session, where she'd work with current scholarship recipients on everything from study skills to college applications to life planning. On Tuesday, she'd video conference with community leaders in Oregon who were implementing their own foster model program. Thursday, she'd speak at a conference in Washington, D.C., about sustainable philanthropy and the importance of community-based solutions to educational inequality. At 72, Margaret Foster was busier than she'd ever been during her teaching career, but she'd never felt more purposeful, more connected to the future she was helping to create. The recognition and awards were gratifying, but the real reward came in moments like these, sitting in her kitchen, reading letters from students whose lives had been transformed, knowing that her work would continue long after she was gone. The kitchen table where she'd once graded spelling tests now served as mission control for a movement that was transforming communities across America and potentially around the world. The house her children had worried about losing to charity had become a pilgrimage site for educators and philanthropists who wanted to understand how one person's vision could create such far-reaching change. And Margaret herself, the woman her family had once dismissed as naive and out of touch, had become living proof that the most powerful force for change isn't money or fame or political influence. It's simply the willingness to see potential where others see problems. The persistence to act on that vision one day at a time, one student at a time, one transformed life at a time, and the faith that small acts of generosity can compound into movements that reshape society. Margaret opened her laptop and began reviewing the newest scholarship applications, each one representing another opportunity to change a life and strengthen a community. Tomorrow's leaders were hidden in that stack of digital files: future doctors and teachers, engineers and social workers, innovators and healers who would someday change the world in ways she couldn't even imagine. As the afternoon sun filled her kitchen with golden light, Margaret Foster smiled and got back to work. After all, she had a legacy to build, one student at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. And unlike traditional inheritances that diminish with each generation, this legacy would only grow stronger, creating ripples of positive change that would extend far beyond anything she could measure or control. The woman who'd been mocked for giving away her fortune had instead created something infinitely more valuable, a model for how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, and proof that the best inheritance you can leave isn't money in a bank account, but a world made better by your presence in it.